AMBS in. And so I kind of told my story, and I introduced myself, and then I introduced the Old Testament with a little bit of a mini lecture about its different parts and how it is viewed from the Jewish perspective as their Bible, as well as from the Christian perspective as part of our Bible. And so I believe there's a recording available if anyone is interested in catching up. And at the beginning of that, I mentioned 9 reasons I love the Old Testament, but I didn't go into a lot of detail. And I thought that today I would go into each of those reasons with a little more detail, give some examples, and invite conversation. So why I love the Old Testament, part 2. You might remember this one. I love the Old Testament because its characters are humans, not heroes. And as I think about this reason, there are just so many examples I could give to illustrate this, that we could spend the entire hour just talking about this. But for one example, I want to talk a little bit about the early kings of Israel as an example of humans, not heroes. Saul, David, and Solomon are the first 3 kings of Israel when we have the stories of its golden age, at least that's how parts of the Bible portray it, as a united kingdom before the division into north and south after the reign of Solomon. Now, when you think of Solomon, what do you think of? I'll repeat your answer. What do you think of? Wisdom, wisest king in the world, right? Wise king. Anything else? Well-dressed. Not even Solomon in all his glory, right? Yeah. Anything else? Oh, yeah. He had a lot of wives and lots of girlfriends too. This is true.
And they did go bad.
He did go bad. He did go. In what ways did he go bad?
Started worshiping foreign gods that his wives looked.
Yeah.
So was a fairly oppressive ruler towards the end of his reign. And Rehoboam caused the revolution by saying he was just going to be worse.
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly right. So, so we tend to think of the positive attributes of Solomon. Maybe if we ask the same question about David, it'd be interesting. We might be a little more aware of David's faults. But actually, the prophet Samuel, early on, before Saul was even selected, before David was selected as a king, Samuel the prophet, and let me switch what I'm showing you. There we go. Samuel warned the people when they wanted a king. He's like, okay, this is what a king is going to do. And it was exactly what you said. And remind me of your name?
Oh, Egbert Lee.
Egbert Lee. Okay. So I thought maybe you introduced yourself last week. I wasn't sure. The enslavement. The king is going to enslave not just war captives, but your sons and daughters, right? There's going to be forced hard labor to build things. The king's going to take a lot of your money, a lot of your resources for the good of his building projects. His people will be enriched at the cost of your families. And on that day, you will cry out because of your king, but the Lord will not answer on that day. Like it's a very, very big warning. And this is exactly what happens in the reign of Solomon. Solomon has a lot of stories about him that are laudatory, especially the first part of his life, his great wisdom. And when God offers him everything, he chooses wisdom above all else, right? So God gives him everything as a reward. Like these are the stories that are in our children's Bibles. These are the stories we remember. These are the sort of morals we take from Solomon if we regard him as a hero, that wisdom is better, as Proverbs would say, than gold. But Solomon's story does not end well. And in fact, his entire reign is marked with this oppression of his own people and his worship of the gods that his numerous foreign alliances via marriage, via wives and girlfriends brought into the kingdom, right? And so by the time we get to Psalm 72, which we don't know when this was written. It says of Solomon, it's the only psalm that is attributed to Solomon. But one thing about these titles in the Psalms, you might know that scholars think that they're more like dedications than they are like indications of who wrote it, right? So this is a Solomonic psalm, meaning we're supposed to have Solomon's story in our heads as we read it, right? It's like it's suggesting what scholars call an intertext, or a text to keep in mind as you're reciting, reading, praying this text. So rather than thinking of it as Solomon sitting in his study, surrounded by his scrolls, writing this, think about it as other people responding to the story of Solomon's great and terrible reign, right? And if we read it on the surface, it sounds very positive, very affirming of like a good and righteous king. Give your king justice, O God, right? May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. It goes on, and it talks about the king having dominion. Like this is it sounds very, to our ears, nationalistic, right? May his foes bow down before him, militaristic. But why? Why should all these things happen? For he delivers the needy, the poor, and those who have no helper. From oppression and violence, he redeems their life. This is the condition upon which these blessings should be given to the king. And so there is a thread of interpretive tradition that sees this psalm as speaking in two voices. The first one is the sort of surface, long live the king, celebration of the king who God has chosen. But underneath, there is an implied critique that if the king doesn't live up to this standard, then the king doesn't deserve all the blessings, right? Did Solomon do these things? A lot of them he didn't do, right? So as you read this psalm, one way to read it is ironically and as a critique of kingship and empire. So Solomon as an example of a human, not a hero. Even though if you look at especially our children's Bibles, we only talk about the good stuff, right? Because we want a moral to the story. We long as humans to have models, to learn lessons, to find ways to apply these biblical stories to our own lives. And that is a laudable desire, right? But I think sometimes we miss some of the deeper lessons if we stay at the surface in that way. All right, that was reason number one. I am going to leave plenty of time for questions. But if you have a burning question about one of my reasons, please raise your hand. We can also interrupt the presentation. I love the Old Testament because of its literary diversity, is one thing I said. The Bible is a literary collection, right? And it's like a library. I tell my students, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library, right? And you've got so many kinds of literature. It's like if you enter your favorite public library or your favorite seminary library, in my case, I don't expect that every book on the shelf is going to be the same kind of thing. The Bible is a library we can, because of the technology of the book, we can throw it in our backpacks and take a whole library with us, right? So we have origin stories and myths, by which I don't mean lies, but I mean capital M myths, which are stories that orient us to why we're here and what we're supposed to do with this life. I think of the first stories of Genesis in this way. Etiologies, which is a fancy word for stories that explain why life is the way it is. Etiologies are a cross-cultural genre, right? The Bible has stories about like, why was this place called Beersheba? Here's a story that tells why. Why do we have the tradition not to eat the tendon, this particular tendon? You know, why do we not do that? Well, because of the story of Jacob wrestling. You know, there's etiologies. Why is life the way it is? Even the story of Genesis 2 and 3, I was talking with my students this week of the snake and the man and the woman in the garden. Even though we've been taught that that's about the first sin and it's a story about sin, it could be read instead, or in addition, as an etiology about why life is so hard. Why is food so scarce? Why is it so hard to till the land? Why is childbirth so dangerous for women? Why is there conflict between people, right? And it's a story that tries to explain why life for ancient people, which was really hard and dangerous, lifespans were much shorter in spite of the Bible's the Bible stories of 900-year-old people. The actual people that read and wrote the Bible on the whole didn't live as long as us, right? Um, so why is life the way it is? We have genealogies, poetry of all kinds, from praise to lament to love songs, historical reports, oracles, which is a kind of prophetic speech where a prophet is quoting God, saying, God gave me a message, thus says the Lord, divine quotation marks, here is God, here are God's words for you. We've got some apocalyptic visions that that don't predict the future as much as they interpret history to point to the fact that God is ultimately going to be the victor over evil. That's my take on Daniel in one sentence. Um, Tales of how to be faithful when you've been conquered and you're living under foreign rule, often taking place in a court of a king, the first part of Daniel. Esther, right? How do we live faithfully when we are conquered, when we are in exile, when others are in power over our lives? We've got laws and instructions. I talked about Torah last week. Thought experiments. What if I actually see the book of Job this way? What if there was a perfectly righteous man and everything bad happened to him? How would we make theological sense of that? And the whole book is a struggle with that question, and people debate whether or not it ends with a satisfying answer. Folk wisdom, like Proverbs, all of these 2-line or 3-line sayings that are supposed to help guide your life. Philosophy, I'm thinking of Ecclesiastes that struggles with the the absurdity of existence when we're all going to die someday. At least that's how some people interpret it. Short fiction, that's how I think of Jonah. Was there a prophet named Jonah? Sure. Like I believe that there was a prophet named Jonah, but the story about Jonah, I think, is more of a satire or humorous story. That's the last one, in the form of short fiction that is turning Jonah into an anti-prophet. Jonah doesn't want to be a prophet. Jonah speaks only one sentence, and even though he's the worst prophet ever, his prophecy is the most effective. Everybody repents and everybody's saved. The really good prophets that give lots of oracles and like are much more cooperative with God, their prophecies don't always work as well. And so I think it's a little bit of a satire that is supposed to help us think about how we want vengeance for our enemies. If we're really honest, sometimes Jonah didn't want the Ninevites to be saved, and how God's mercies are bigger than our human desire for vengeance. So that was much longer than I expected it to be. But those are some examples of the literary diversity. And there's also theological diversity, and I'm going to be much more focused in this. I'm going to give you an example from wisdom literature. Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but years of the wicked will be short. The hope of the righteous ends in gladness, but the expectation of the wicked comes to nothing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if life worked that way, right? And much of Proverbs asserts that it does. If you just are a wise person, if you choose life, if you walk in the ways of God, in the ways of righteousness, then you can expect a good ending. This is a perspective that is also echoed in the book of Deuteronomy, and is sometimes called Deuteronomistic way of thinking, where it's really kind of a binary, like there's good and there's evil. If you're good, there will be reward. If you're evil, there will be punishment. It's a point of view that is too simplistic and doesn't always work out, and that gets reflected in books like Ecclesiastes and Job, as well as, I would venture, all of our life experiences. Proverbs, however, isn't just a book that we can discount because it's too simplistic. Proverbs itself has a diversity of theology within it. Because even though Proverbs is like, choose life and you'll be great, Proverbs then says, well, the human mind plans the way, but the Lord directs the steps. So you never know, right? But Ecclesiastes takes it farther. This is a piece of art by Salvador Dali. portraying the author of Ecclesiastes, often called Kohelet, because that's the Hebrew word for teacher, preacher, gatherer of wisdom. And I love this piece of art because it is this king, because he calls himself a king, the writer of this book, holding up a kind of mirror, like there's a kind of a mirror in the center. And I think that that's a really profound interpretation of what Ecclesiastes invites us to do, to see ourselves reflected in the existential struggles of the book. So Ecclesiastes starts out with a bang. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. Whew. This is not the theme verse of AMBS, right? It's a challenge for everyone that loves learning, but it is also, I think, it captures some aspects of human experience very accurately, right? That there are times when we feel that the more we know about everything going on in the world, the worse it is, the worse we feel, the more hopeless we are, the less we know what to do, right? Um, and so some more examples of Ecclesiastes' point, worldview. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. Vanity is a word meaning vapor, or it's sometimes translated meaninglessness or futility or even absurdity, but it literally means something like vapor or smoke, like you can't grasp it. You see it and it's gone. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Well, this is hopeless, right? This is contending with death and having no hope for anything that comes after. And then this really adds to it. And I thought the dead who have already died more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has not yet been born, not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. This is part of our scripture, right? Written 2,500, 2,300 years ago, people debate it. And yet, how contemporary some of the feelings sound when we face the terrors and tragedies of our world, both globally and things that we keep in our own hearts, right? It's not the only theological perspective in the Bible for which I'm very grateful. We also have Proverbs, which is a lot more hopeful, right? And we also have Job, which I would argue is hopeful in a different way, although it struggles with these questions of meaning very profoundly. So we've got a book that says, you know, the righteous will be rewarded, the wicked will be punished. We've got and choose righteousness and your life will have meaning. And we have a book that says it's pointless. Ecclesiastes does end with hope. There is sort of a turn where there's some fear the Lord language, and some scholars think that this is the author sort of coming out of this existential crisis back into a kind of faith. Other people say that the book didn't originally end that way, and people were uncomfortable with how depressing it was, and they added a hopeful ending to like make it a little more a little more palatable. But whatever the case, whether the ending is original or not, there is a turn in Ecclesiastes. If you read all the way to the end, it ends with a little bit more possibility. And a little bit of a carpe diem attitude. Eat, drink, and be merry. This is the purpose of human life. There's a little bit of a like, enjoy yourself while you're here. But then there is a nod toward fear of the Lord at the end as well. So, oh, there it is. Eat, drink, and be merry. Find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of life God gives us, for this is our lot. Like it's still very, you know, we can't change this, but there is a little bit more instruction for how to live in spite of the questions. So I didn't mean to depress anyone with that like glimpse into Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, just one example of the theological diversity. I think in my experience, when my students have struggled with reading the Old Testament, it is because certain theological perspectives rise to the top and become emphasized more than others. And the whole Old Testament, excuse me, then gets painted with that brush, right? That the stories of conquest, war, battle, the stories of of terrible violence against especially the most oppressed in society. These stories are not endorsing it, but they're stories that are triggering or traumatic even to read. I'm thinking of some stories in Judges. The sort of in implicit militarism or nationalism in some of the stories that rises to the top like cream, and that's all people see. But in fact, the Old Testament speaks not with one voice, but with dozens. And the Old Testament is in conversation with itself, and its authors see things differently. There's an anti-king thread that goes throughout the whole Old Testament. And there's a pro-king. The book of Judges is pro-king because it says, look how terrible life is without a king. Here are all these awful stories I'm going to tell you. And it actually ends with, this is what life was like when there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? But getting a king didn't actually fix that problem. It's just that the king did what was right in his own eyes, which wasn't always good, right? And so it's this back and forth, push and pull. How do we make sense of our history conversation? Um, there wasn't a big meeting with all the writers of the Old Testament, and they didn't sign off on a statement of faith that they were all going to adhere to, right? This is the grand diversity of human interpretation of the Israelite story, all included. I'm sure there were voices that were excluded. There's always an editing process, right? But I'm always stunned at the diversity that was included. I mentioned this last week, and so I won't spend long on it today because I think I talked about it a little more last week than the others. I love the Old Testament because, in my interpretive lens, the love of God is at its heart. The love of God is on display just as deeply as in the New Testament. That's my interpretive lens. And examples of this that I just briefly want to share with you. And I think I may have mentioned this when I spoke last year. Are in the what Christians call the 10 Commandments, Jews call the 10 words. For Christians, you shall have no other gods before me is the first one, right? If you go to a courthouse and the 10 Commandments are hung up, that's the first thing you read. In fact, the 10 Commandments in courthouses are just like bits and pieces of this pulled out of context. There's so much that's not there, right? But the I am the Lord your God, the identifying who God is Yahweh, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In Jewish interpretive tradition, that's the first word. And you shall have no other gods before me is the second word. And this sets up Torah, instruction, the first 5 books of the Bible, what we often call law. This sets it up as a whole body of a way of thinking, a way of life in which God's mercy and love and grace comes first before the people even have a chance to respond or reciprocate, right? God delivered first. God's mercy comes first in the way they tell their story. So that is one way that I see God's love being the basis of Torah. We also get Psalms like Psalm 136. God's steadfast love endures forever. That's the second half of all 26 verses, right? Steadfast love. And I think I'd have to look it up, but I'm 99% sure this is a translation of chesed, which is a word for loyalty. And it is a covenantal word, right? God's covenantal love, covenantal commitment. God's interest in you endures forever, no matter what. And I see this unconditional love of God as just as deeply present in the Hebrew scriptures as in the New Testament. And we can talk about, you might disagree. We can talk about it. Yes.
Say that is the dominant theme.
Of the Old Testament? Oh, wow. Would you say that's the dominant theme of the Old Testament, the love of God? I mean, I think love is a very Christian word in some ways. Not that Jews don't talk about love, but the word chesed is real. I think the chesed of God, the steadfast loyalty of God. So it's about, so yes, but it's not like the sentimental love that we might think of today. It's about the committed love, the I am with you always love, that commitment of God. Um, and that is the theme. If I was going to name a theme, that's what I would name. It's hard for me to name one theme. But if I was going to, I would also say that the felt absence of that, the human experience of God abandoning us, is also recorded, right? Because that is part of human experience, is feeling abandoned and alone. Jesus on the cross modeled that experience as well, felt that experience too. Thank you for asking. I love the Old Testament because reading it is a cross-cultural and intercultural experience. So as I say this one, I'm thinking of cross-cultural and intercultural, like across time and space, and in the world today. So we have today, right now, a global community of people reading and interpreting the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole. If we expand our imagination and think of, and I'm going to get to this, the Jewish communities that are interpreting their Bible as well. Like, we've got so many cross-cultural and intercultural voices interpreting this same collection of literature, which is such an opportunity to learn from each other. But also across time, we've got 2,000 years of interpreters to learn from all sorts of nationalities and ethnicities and perspectives. And so in terms of who we're reading with, I think we have to work hard to reach out to and connect with readers from across time and across the world, right? We have to be intentional about not just reading with people like us. But the Old Testament is also expresses the cross-cultural and intercultural experience through telling the story of Israel and its neighbors, right? And I don't think I have time to share much about this, but I just want to give you the Book of Ruth as an example. And if we think about just chapter 1 of the Book of Ruth, and I'm going to zoom in on some of these pictures, and I can share these slides with you if anyone's interested in my whole slide deck on Ruth. If we look at some of these interpretations of what's going on in Ruth 1, when Ruth is moving back to Israel after having gone to Moab because of a famine, all of the male people in her household die, her sons, her husband, she has no grandchildren, and then her 2 daughters-in-law going with her, her 2 daughters-in-law are Moabite. She is Israelite. She sends them back, right? There's this, I think, profound moment. You could say it's despair. Naomi might have named it as despair. Like, I am too wretched. I want to be alone. You're bothering me, right? Or it could be that a moment of cross-cultural connection when Naomi realizes, wait a minute, I am going back to my people because I am a foreigner and a widow. And I have no, like, I'm completely alone. But if my daughters-in-law come with me, they are also widows, and then they're going to be foreigners when they have their mother's house, and it says mother's house, not father's. They have their mother's house they could return to. They could return to their family. Why are they coming with me and taking on this situation that I am running from, that I am escaping, right? That I'm trying to create a new life back with my extended family in Israel. And so I think moments like that can be seen as cross-culturally rich when we're exploring the narratives. And then when we realize this, you can see that this piece of art shows Ruth clinging to Naomi and Orpah kind of in the background passively getting ready to leave. The history of tradition has often seen Orpah negatively. This is William Blake. Orpah and Ruth are sort of mirror images of each other, but there is definitely a preference for Ruth's action here with Naomi almost looking like the Virgin Mary with a halo, right, in terms of how Blake portrayed her. And then you get Chagall which is a much more like the three of them are together. Chagall captures that moment of before the goodbyes are said, when they are all three together as a unit. And then this modern piece of art, I can find the artist and send it to you, which shows, I think, a beautiful cross-cultural image of both women making choices that lead to life. Ruth making a choice that leads her to nurturing Naomi's life and making a commitment that mirrors Yahweh's commitment to the people of Israel. That same word chesed is used. And then Orpah almost looks like she's dancing her way back to those houses in the distance, right? We don't have to set up Orpah and Ruth as a good example and a bad example. We instead can interpret in a way that understands the different choices they're making in their cultural context and how both choices lead to life for them in different ways. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. I need to move on to the next one so we have time for conversation. I love the Old Testament because it still surprises me after all these years, right? I've been reading the Old Testament all my life, but in a scholarly way or in an academic way, along with a devotional way for 25 years. And it still surprises me. And an example of that is Job 38, that I want to share just a couple verses with you. Sometimes there's an image, especially in biblical poetry, that I'm just stunned because I've read this lots of times and didn't see it. And I want to give credit. Many of you know Janine Birchie Johnson. She is the one who noticed this when I was leading a retreat on Job a lot of years ago, maybe 8 years ago. And this is when when God is giving Job a speech after Job's like, show up, God, I'm suffering, give me an answer. And God refuses to give Job an answer that directly answers his question, but God gives Job a different kind of answer, which one interpretation is, the world is bigger than you. Yes, you're going through a terrible time, but consider all of these elements of the world, these wild places, all of these creatures who are mine and whom I love. They are also here. They are also important. The world is bigger and wilder than you're acknowledging.
God rewarded Job with a really grand vision because it's
Ooh, it was mind-blowing. Yes, you could. Some people read it that way. Absolutely. You do. Thank you. Here's the part that blew my mind. Has the rain a father, or who has fathered the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? And who has given birth to the hoarfrost of heaven? So these are all rhetorical questions, right? Meaning the answer is obvious, and you don't have to say it. And the answer is, I did, right? Because this whole poem is like, who was present at creation? Who knows when the mountain goats give birth? I do, you don't. Who fathered the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? Here is a maternal image of God, God with a womb giving birth to ice that I didn't even know was there. So just an example of how the Bible can surprise me after all these years. When we have time for discussion, I would love to hear if you've had a similar experience. Sorry about that. All right. Let me just see. I think I only have, how many do I have left? Okay. I have 4 more left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So I will try to finish this up in 5 minutes so that we can have conversation. I love the Old Testament because I don't have to love every story to engage with it authentically and meaningfully. There are so many examples. From Genesis, when Abram pretends Sarai is his sister because he's afraid the Pharaoh's going to kill him, and then she gets taken into the palace of Pharaoh until there are 3 of these stories, 2 with Abram, 1 with Isaac. Like, what is happening? I don't have to like that story to engage with it meaningfully. Same thing with the horrific, violent stories at the end of Judges, especially. Same thing with prophets like Hosea, who use a marriage metaphor to condemn Israel by comparing Israel to a faithless wife and actually having abusive images of Israel being thrown out naked into the desert. I don't have to like the imagery, the symbols to engage with the stories. In fact, I experience the Bible as welcoming my rage and my questions. I love the Old Testament because it gives Christians shared scripture with Judaism and shared tradition with Islam. Um, there's a link here that I can share with you later that compares the canons of Judaism and different Christian canons, just to kind of get a picture of how much is shared. And there's a great book called The Bible and the Quran, Biblical Figures in the Islamic Tradition. It's by John Kaltner and Yunus Mirza, which has a chapter on every biblical character or figure that appears in the Quran and how and what elements of the story are the same and what are different, and which characters have names and which don't. I found it to be just an amazing and very accessible way to get to know the Quran, which is a learning curve for me and something I am trying to do. I love the Old Testament because it serves as a witness to one people's resilience in the face of the worst thing they could imagine coming true. I talked about this last week, and so I will just say that when you have an unconditional covenant with God who says your kingdom will last forever, our covenant will last forever, and then that kingdom crumbles and you are forcibly migrated and you have no more temple where you go to offer sacrifices to worship this God, everything that gives you identity is taken away from you. And yet somehow, largely through these writings, largely through the scribal culture that preserved these stories, this people retained their identity and they retained their commitment to this God, Yahweh. It's really remarkable to me that Israel, the Israelite culture, the Judahite culture didn't just disappear along with its temple and its king. Psalm 137 is an example of one people's the experience of despair in light of this situation, which I will let you look up on your own. It's the most infamous psalm in terms of saying something that we don't want to say because it's so offensive. It's the "may their babies be dashed against rocks" curse against the enemies, right? It's like the worst verse in the Bible for some people, but it was born out of this experience of having lost everything and being forced to live in the land of your oppressor. Finally, I think, yes, finally, I love the Old Testament because it connects me with thousands of years of interpreters. And I talked about this a little bit already. But in other words, even though the Old Testament is in some ways one people's story of their relationship with God, their covenant with God, it can be our story too. Not because not because so I want to resist the Christian tendency to say, well, the Old Testament is, quote, really about Jesus, right? It's really predicting the coming of Jesus, and that's really its purpose. That's not what I'm saying. Christians read it as an anticipation of Jesus, and that's a beautiful Christian lens for the Bible, but that's not really what it's about in my view. It really is one people's story. It really is the scripture of Judaism. But because it was taken up in the Christian scriptures, because we have 2,000 years of Christians interpreting and valuing and choosing this scripture, it is our story too. It is in a different way our story, because it is the first part of our Bible that also includes the New Testament, right? In that way, it is different. It functions differently for us than it does for Jews, for whom it is the whole Bible, along with a whole body of rabbinic interpretive tradition that helps them read it. But it is our story too. We can respect its particularity. We can respect the way it is different in Jewish tradition, and we can claim it as ours. And that is something that really has become, well, one of the main parts of what I feel my life's work to be. And that's the end of my 9 or 10 reasons. Thank you, and let's talk. Please, what are your questions? Yes.
To your love of the Old Testament, clearly Jesus loved the Old Testament.
Oh, absolutely.
in what he chose to quote and where he would end his quotation, what he did not quote. What can we learn from Jesus' selection of the Old Testament?
That's such a great question. What can we learn from the way Jesus quoted his own scripture? It's a little tricky because we certainly don't have every speech that Jesus spoke. Like, we don't have everything that Jesus ever said. So we can't ever say with confidence that Jesus never interpreted this or that story. But we can look at what we do have. And we can see how, Jesus chose to quote from the Hebrew prophets frequently. And almost set himself, I think you could argue that Jesus was putting himself in conversation with that tradition of speaking into the current situation and offering both guidance and critique, a critique born of love. Like, I don't want to, I think one mistake we make is when we think that Jesus was against the first, like, Christians tend to think it was Jesus against first century Judaism. Jesus only had critique for Judaism. I don't think that's true. I think Jesus loved Judaism, and Jesus was part of Judaism of the first century, and Jesus was teaching and offering sometimes hard teachings in the same, like, in a way that was common, that other people did too, right? So I think Jesus was engaging lovingly with his tradition, and sure, also critically. But he used his own scripture as a resource to do that. Good question.
The seminar had a conference, as you said, with Jewish scholars, and I think the title was Interpreting the Old Testament After the Holocaust. I never heard the conclusions of the conference. Maybe there weren't any, but it would be intriguing to learn what people said about how the Holocaust changes our understanding of the Old Testament. But my second question is this: you're going to meet again, I think. That was announced. Is that right?
There are hopes. I mean, there are no concrete plans, but there are hopes for because this was the second of 3 events, but it wasn't the exact same people coming to each event. So there are hopes for a third gathering, yes, but it's not yet concrete.
My suggestion is that the topic of the next conversation be interpreting the Old Testament in light of Gaza. What would you say to that?
Yeah, actually, that is something that was named. So this consultation, Reading the Bible After the Holocaust, brought together, for anyone who didn't hear, there is an article in Anabaptist World that describes it in detail. If you go to the Anabaptist World website and Google Reading the Bible After the Holocaust, it should come up. The point was, this was a very introductory foray into interfaith dialogue. It was the first time that an interfaith event happened at AMBS in 40 years, I think, like a specifically interfaith event with that was meant for conversation between Jews and Mennonites. And so part of the agreement, so that people felt welcome and safe, is that talks wouldn't be recorded and minutes would not be taken. So we don't have results to share with people, because we wanted everyone to feel that this was about genuine meeting with each other and not about, I don't know, you didn't have to worry like, oh, later my words are going to get reported and they'll be taken out of context, that kind of thing. It was about relationship building. So we don't have results, but for me, there are results, right? It changed me. And so I think, for one, we need to have a Judaism course at AMBS for our students, which we don't currently have. And I'm thinking about my syllabi and how I'm teaching. Like, there is a implicit in a lot of the history of Christian biblical interpretation, there is an implicit prejudice against Jews, and I'm thinking like over the last 100 years. And like, it helped me think, how do I need to equip my students to notice this when they are preparing their sermons? And how do I equip them to thoughtfully engage with texts in the New Testament, like the Gospel of John, that say really harsh things about, quote, the Jews, and are often read during Easter without any kind of contextualization or any kind of acknowledgement that this to Jewish ears would sound really horrible, right? So so it changed it helped me clarify some of my own goals and some hopes I have for AMBS. Your second question, actually, yes. What was named at the end of the consultation by multiple people, Jews and Mennonites, was that we just kind of tiptoed around this issue of the land because we knew there would be disagreement, and we wanted to get to know each other, and we wanted to establish trust, right? And so there is a desire on the part of at least some of the participants that if we meet again, the topic will be the land, like that we have to go there in order to really establish and build trust. I also learned from getting to know this group that there are a huge variety of perspectives within Judaism on the current nation of Israel. And some of this was back before October of last year, right? So we didn't have the current situation happening, but there was still the situation of the last 75 years that was ongoing that we didn't talk about much, right? But there were a lot of Jews, several that I can think of, that I had individual conversations with who participated, that they wanted me to know that their synagogue cares about Palestinian justice and they talk about it. And so I think it's another thing to realize, just like there's this huge diversity within Christians today, from Christian nationalists who have this Christian Zionism that influences their views, to anti-Zionist Christians. There is a similar spectrum within Judaism, and so to keep that in mind, so that we don't equate Judaism with modern Israel, is super important for me. Did that help? Do you have a response?
Yeah, I guess. They're both examples of political developments that interact with theology.
Irvin.
I'll let you repeat it.
Oh, what was the question? Okay.
Political, historical developments that are related to theology. And so your conversations, I think, are very important.
Political, did you say historical? Did you say political conversations that relate to theology? Yeah. Certainly, theologizing is happening for some people when they are analyzing the current situation, right? Yeah. Thank you. Yes. That's fine. I'll repeat it. Okay, no problem. I'll repeat it.
So the Old Testament has a number of books that we never read, we never hear preached from. Nahum, Obadiah.
Yes. Yes.
Do you love those books? How can we learn to love them too?
Oh, what a great question. The question was, the Old Testament has several books that we rarely read from or preach from. For example, Nahum, Obadiah, Zephaniah. Do I also love these books? If so, why? And can I help you love them too? So Nahum is a hard book for me to say I love. It's a text that is about Nineveh and the fall of Nineveh and the fall of Assyria, actually, and it rejoices in the fall of this Israelite enemy, right? It's a book that is very much, but I think if we read it in conversation with Jonah, a book that rejoices in the salvation of Nineveh, then I think I can love that conversation. So do I love Nahum? I feel neutral toward Nahum, but I love the conversation that Nahum and Jonah have together, because we see the diversity of theological interpretations of history, and we see the conversation that is happening within our Bibles. And I think that can help us reflect on our own attitudes toward enemies, or people who, people whose actions horrify us, right? What are our attitudes toward them? Zephaniah, actually, I do kind of love Zephaniah, I think. It has some, like, I would have to look at it, and I can't tell you why, but I have a feeling of fondness for Zephaniah. I feel like it has some good visions that are really interesting and juicy to dig into. So my answer is, I don't feel warm and fuzzy love for every book, but I don't find any of them meaningless and without potential. Um, but sometimes I have to dig deep and look at the context that they're born out of in order to get there. Um, and you don't have to do that for every book in the Old Testament in order to love the Old Testament. You can make choices about how to spend your time. We all have limited years on this planet, as Ecclesiastes reminds us, right? Um, but so I would say ultimately yes to your question, but those are my qualifications. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yes, Lewis remarked about the Psalm, and I think it's true of the whole of the Old Testament, that if we think about the nasty bits as the reactions we can excite out of people by our own misdoings, we may learn a very great, would certainly apply to Nahum, who I admit haven't read a word of. The chariot was notably cruel to its enemies. Wants revenge. Now, revenge is a lousy emotion, but exciting a desire for revenge is a lousy act.
Yes. Yes. So the question is about, or the comment is about, C.S. Lewis wrote about the Psalms, that the difficult or nasty parts can reflect human, did you say human human reactions to their own mistreatment? So as readers, we learn what happens when we mistreat someone, that it naturally brings forth these desires for revenge that are chilling to read, but the trauma that they're born out of is very real. One needs that education too. I agree with you. I agree with you.
I excuse myself because I belong somewhere.
Oh yeah. Oh, and thank you. And it is 11:53, which I think is a little over time, but does anyone want to say anything to close us out, or is there anything you want to push back on and say, 8 of your 9 reasons I get, but that 9th one I just don't know about?
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate all your questions, really. Thank you.